I'm fascinated by crows. How about you? In this episode, Kaeli Swift joins me. She's a corvid researcher, and I call her, get this, the Jane Goodall of corvids. Now, what's a corvid? It's everything crow, raven, jays, magpies, and nutcrackers. Now, she is so insightful. And these corvids? They're all intelligent in their own ways. So here's a question for you. How do we actually define intelligence in animals? We do a deep dive into this. But first, let's talk a little bit about crows. Now, have you ever heard about crow funerals? If you haven't, it's fascinating, and it's definitely not what you think it is. When a crow dies, several crows will actually fly down and surround their dead friend. Now, it's been established they're actually studying it to learn what may have happened to the friend, so in the future, possibly, they can prevent whatever danger or threat it may represent. Crazy smart, right? Did you know crows can actually recognize individual faces and remember them for years? Then they'll actually go and tell their friends, hey, that human guy over there, he's mean, watch out for him. Or that human girl over there, she's really kind, so don't worry about her. Now get this, there are crows in Japan that actually get nuts and they fly over a road and they drop it on a road and then they wait for cars to run over them and then they can go down and eat them. Now we also talk about the difference between a raven and crow. You know how crows and ravens seem always to be in people's attentions? From Edgar Allan Poe to Brandon Lee in the movie The Crow? Well, we talk all corvid in this episode, and there's a lot. So get ready for Murders the Cause. This one will have you telling the rest of your flock how smart these birds really are.
For real, 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 for real. Got a bunch of furry friends and I love them all the same. I'm an animal lover, veterinarian is the name. Let's share some pet stories from heartwarming to strange, losses and gains, from wacky to insane. For real. You're now tuned in to For Real with your host, Mark Kyle.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the For Real podcast. Today, my guest is Kaeli Swift. And guess what, guys? We're going to have fun today. There's a lot of people out there, when they hear this, and by the way, Kaylee, even before you start talking, when I really started doing my homework after we talked last time, there's so many questions I have for you. This is going to be a really fun. First of all, thanks for joining the show, and I can't wait for everybody to hear everything you have to say.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to talk crow.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk a lot of crow, and I'll probably be eating some crow at some point in this thing too. But like I always do on this show, I really want to talk about you first, so everybody gets to know you. I know you're in Seattle, you grew up in that area, but let's talk about that and how you got to where we are today, kind of a little bit of your journey, your fascination with corvids and all that kind of stuff, and whatever you want to talk about so everybody gets to know you.
Sure. So I grew up with a very strong interest in birds and animals. You know, I was a nature-y kid. I wasn't a super academic kid. So this career path was not something that I really envisioned for myself because I just didn't have a very strong academic performance. And it took a long time and a lot of very hard, dedicated work to sort of figure out how to exist in a system that wasn't really designed for people with brains like mine. But I got there eventually. And once I got to college, I actually went to college sort of wanting to go more marine direction. I was really interested in cephalopods and that kind of thing. But I wasn't interested enough in that I picked a school that had any semblance of a marine program. So then I pivoted and kind of returned to birds, which is something that I was really interested in as a kid. And in my exploration of birds, I started to read more about the work that was being done on corvids, reading authors like Bernd Heinrich and John Marsliff, and that just kind of really cemented my understanding that working with corvids was going to be the best way to be able to ask a lot of the questions that I was interested in. I love corvids, but really what I love is asking questions about animal behavior.
Hmm.
And so in thinking about that, I wanted to think about like what animal would let me best ask those questions in a way that supported the kind of like life that I wanted. And at the time, corvids were a really great option for that because they're a really accessible critter, right?
Right.
So, and I was fortunate and lucky enough that my connections at Willamette University, which is where I did my undergrad, the faculty, David Craig, that I was working with there, knew John Marsliff. They were co-authoring
That's
a paper
cool.
together, the facial recognition paper that a lot of people are familiar with when they think about crows recognizing faces.
Hmm.
So he put us in touch, and then I spent the next couple of years doing a variety of just kind of like mishmash jobs and working towards this goal of going to grad school to work with John, which I eventually succeeded doing. And yeah, and then I got to really live out my dream, which was just to have this really focused research effort on crows for 6 years. I did a dual master's PhD program. And yeah, it was wonderful. And then after I graduated, I got to do a postdoc on Canada jays, which are a relative of the crow. And now I am in a completely different group of birds called monarchs, which are small flycatchers, not crows. We could get into the specifics of that pivot maybe at some other time, but suffice it to say that there's not, despite the sort of very high volume of public interest in crows, there's not actually a lot of long-term job prospects. There are some,
Yeah.
but it's a harder thing to maintain through the entirety of one's professional career, though I am hopeful to sort of circle back to crow work at some point. I am a pretty early career scientist, so
Well, you're a writer too, so you do a
yeah.
lot of things. But you know, one for everybody that's listening, because they're in the, I know that there's a scientific word which I can't pronounce probably, but I know they're considered corvids. Can you tell everybody what a corvid is other than a crow?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Corvidae family, if we think about how we organize animals, right? We start at like these really, really big umbrellas, and then we narrow down until we get to the smallest unit that we divide animals, which is a species, right?
Right.
But above species is genus, and above genus is family. So the Corvidae family contains the jays of the world, crows, ravens, rooks, jackdaws, nutcrackers, choughs, magpies. There's a whole variety of birds, including some types of birds that most North American residents are completely unfamiliar with. There's types of corvids you probably haven't ever even heard of before that are like tropical species. So yeah, but your standard blue jays, magpies, Steller's jays, Clerk's nutcrackers, ravens, crows, they're all in the same Corvidae family.
You know what's weird is that so when I was doing my homework and I didn't know what a nutcracker was. And I'm a bird person. I grew up in the Midwest, but cardinals were always like one of my favorites. And of course, blue jays, even though they're mean, I always liked blue jays. And even brought a wren that had fallen from a nest with baby feeding it, brought it back to life, and a bunch of different things. But when I started digging into the nutcrackers, first of all, they're pretty. There's some really cool colors with them. But I never even, I know what the nutcracker is because, there's all the famous things, songs and things like that. But I didn't realize there was a bird that was a nutcracker. And I love the idea what they do with seeds, which is really cool. I did a deep dive.
Yeah, they're really interesting, and there's some really cool brain work that we've done with nutcrackers because they are, for your listeners who aren't familiar with them. So some, I think a lot of us have contact and familiarity with the idea that animals like hide food for later, right? Like classic dog hiding a bone. So
Squirrels.
lots of animals, yeah, do that opportunistically. Crows are a good example of that, but some animals have to do it because those resources become the only food that is available to them during winter. And nutcrackers are a really good example of a bird like that. Chickadees, not the ones in your typical urban neighborhood, but like boreal chickadees, for example, are another type of bird that does that. And what that means is that these animals have to hide food in a lot of different places because there's two strategies to food hiding. One is called larder hiding, where think about like a acorn woodpecker or a pine squirrel where they have everything in the same place. They just have this hoard, like a dragon, right? They have this hoard that they defend. But the problem is if your defenses fail, then all of your food can get taken pretty quickly. So then the other option is what we call scatter hoarding, where instead of you putting everything in one place, you hide it at just individual pieces all over a fairly big area. And that's much better for protecting against getting robbed, but it means you have to remember all of those places. And these birds have a remarkable capacity to remember thousands of hiding spots. And, I think we're all sitting here thinking like, I can hardly remember where I put my keys in the morning kind of a thing.
Right.
And so we can appreciate like, well, how do they do that?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm a person. I'm like barely keeping it together. How does this bird remember 1,000 hiding spots? And so there's been a lot of really interesting research, which it sounds like you tapped into, that has tried to understand how that happens.
Well, for me, because I was my biggest, deepest dive was obviously into your background and also on CROWS, and I was thinking a little bit of the similarity because we're going to get into the intelligence of CROWS, and because they're in the same family, are all in the family, the corvid family, do they really all have a real high intelligence? Did all of them do like that? Because memory is intelligence too.
Yeah, that prompts a really interesting but difficult question, which is how we define and measure intelligence, right? And like you just noted, there are lots of different sort of manifestations that we as people can perceive as intelligence. So when we're like, wow, that animal remembers 1,000 hiding spots, that seems really smart, right? Like, is that what that means? Or like, here's a crow that knows how to like make tools and
right.
And the answer is very complicated, but in general, we describe intelligence kind of and this is not something that every scientist who works in this field agrees on. There's no one set definition.
Well, first off, I'm with you on this because I was reading all your stuff about that. I'm in your page, so we're gonna go with you. I really like what you're doing. I really do. I agree 100% with that.
Yeah. So, the kind of standard definition that's generally accepted is the ability to flexibly solve problems with cognition rather than trial and error. And that leaves a lot of stuff out, but it kind of gives us a baseline. And when we think about how we test for that, we have identified what's called the cognitive toolkit, which is a couple of different things that we have been able to identify and track as being things that are very consistently the result of kind of higher executive order thinking, as opposed to things that are more instinctive or learned through trial and error. And I know some people might hear that and go, well, what's wrong with trial and error learning? That's how I learned. That seems like learning. What's wrong with that? And we won't get into the mess of all of that, but just kind of go with me here.
I'm with you.
And trust that that's a little bit, it's not as difficult as you may think. So there's a lot of like spiders, right, that can solve problems through trial and error learning. So then maybe that'll be like, okay, I see. Maybe she has a point. But the things on that list are octopus. Well, so octopus are very smart. So the things that go on that list are things like causal reasoning. So this is a really big one where there's a lot of organisms that can produce really complex products, but they get there through really simple mechanisms and not because they actually understand how it works. So my favorite example is like army ants, right? Army ants move through the jungle, and when they hit an obstacle like a stream, they can build a bridge. Now, they don't build bridges because they have physics degrees or engineering degrees. They don't understand it, but they know how collectively through the process of immersion, they know collectively I have one single part of this job and I do it. And when they all come together, you have a bridge, right? And so again, it's not because they understand how it all works. They just have a job and they execute on that job.
Right.
Versus when when an animal actually kind of understands the sequence of events and how they all fit together. So that's one example. Another is mental time travel. So the ability to sort of reflect on past events, plan for future events, particularly, and this is the third thing, in a flexible way. So do they execute their behaviors in a really rigid way, where sometimes if you change the components of it, suddenly what they're doing makes less sense because they only can do it in one way. And so now the way they're doing it.
Whether or not they can adapt to whatever the situation is.
Yeah, exactly. Causal reasoning, mental flexibility, prospection, and somehow I'm forgetting the last one. It'll come to me. But those are some examples of what we are sort of tracking. And so to circle back to the question that inspired this very long-winded explanation I've given you.
Go with me.
When we talk about the different corvids, often what we see is some of them are really good at some of those things and less good at some of the other ones. Some of them seem to be like common ravens, seem to be pretty good at all of them, right? And so there does seem to be a little bit of a scale where they're not all necessarily equally as good at kind of all of those components in our pseudo equation of intelligence. But some of them are much better at some of those components than the other ones are. And so that's why, like, I would not say that all things are equal across these birds, for sure. I wouldn't say that that's true. But I would say that they in general are usually have one of those things in that toolkit that they're impressively good at.
And we'll be right back.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? Prep Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover Prep Therapy today at prepvet.com. Save 10% with promo code FURREALPODCAST, covered by most pet insurance.
So let's talk about crows. Let's talk about them, first of all, their physical characteristics. And I've had a question for you. When I was digging into this, I read something, and I know you know the answer. And, I'm always very leery of what I read on the internet, right? Because that's where I get most of my research. Now, is a raven and a crow, what I read genetically, they're not really different. Just one's bigger than the other. Are they the same thing? We just have two different names for them?
That's a great question. They are different things.
Okay.
Right. And if you start cutting hairs, we're not all that genetically different from a strawberry.
Right.
So
I'm more of a blueberry anyways.
Yeah. That when we start getting genetics, like the amount of sort of hair splitting, but yes. So across the world, so earlier when we talked about sort of taxonomy and those smallest units that we splice animals into, where species is generally the smallest unit that we define an animal. Across the world, there's about 45 different species of crows and ravens. So in North America, for example, we have American crows, fish crows, common ravens, Chihuahuan ravens. We used to have a crow called the Northwestern crow, but after a lot of genetic and behavioral studies, we found that there wasn't really a warranted distinction anymore with the American crow, so they just kind of got enveloped with the American crow. But in other countries, you can have jungle crows, white-necked ravens, carrion crows, right? There's a huge diversity of species. What gets a little confusing, though, is when somebody asks, what's the difference between a crow and a raven? Mm-hmm. Most of the time, they're asking you to explain the difference between their local species of crows and raven, right? So when somebody asks me that question, they're often asking, like, if I'm looking at a bird in Washington, am I looking at an American crow or a common raven? And that has a really clear answer where these are different animals and we can look at features of their voices, behavior, their appearance to identify the differences between these birds. But the other way that you could ask this question is when, say, a scientist or a person discovers a new bird, how do we know if we're going to call that bird a crow or a raven?
Right.
And the answer to that question is that there isn't an answer. There's no sort of defining thing that is like, this is a crow and this is going to be called something raven.
Okay.
In general, and this speaks to what you were kind of getting at, in general, we call the bigger ones ravens.
Right.
But a really good example of this is like the Hawaiian crow is a really big bird. It should have probably been called the Hawaiian raven, but it's an arbitrary distinction at that level. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as a scientist discovered a bird, and they knew a crow, and if it was a smaller one, they called it a crow, but if they knew what a raven is, they called it exactly a Hawaiian raven or crow or whatever it is, because basically, genetically, they're the same, but they're different birds for the most part. Am I right there?
No, they're not genetically the same.
Okay.
Because that's a big, and species, the term species, and this often surprises people, is also one of those terms that has no set definition in science.
I'm my own species, I'll tell you that much.
How we define species is a constantly debated thing.
Right.
But in general, one of the features that is across the various definitions we have for how we define species, one of the consistent sort of components of that is genetic differences.
Okay.
So they are genetically different animals in that, the American crow is just like a lion and a tiger, right? They're both cats.
Okay.
But like you look at a tiger and you're like, that's different than a lion.
Sure.
And crows and ravens have the exact same relationship where they're in the same genus. So we've been talking a lot about family level, which is Corvidae.
Right.
But the next level down is genus. And for crows and ravens, that's Corvus. And Corvus only contains crows and ravens. The magpies, jays, nutcrackers, they get their own, they're in their own genus, right? There are a bunch of different ones. But all of the world's crows and ravens are in the same genus called Corvus. And then we get to the species level. Tigers and lions are in the same thing. They're in the same genus, but they're different animals. They're different species.
Snow leopard versus whatever. Actually, what's funny is a snow leopard's closer to a tiger than it is other leopards. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, that's pretty cool. I just did an episode on. So I have a question. I want to stay on the crows. It is about crows, but I bounce. I think I told you when we talked before. This is how my mind works. One of the things I read, and I'm curious why that is. So what I read was that crows are not in South America or Antarctica. Why aren't they in South America? I mean, is there any theory behind that? I mean, at least that's what I read.
Yeah, it probably has to do with the sort of evolutionary path of these birds through the world, where, they started in Africa. And then they have sort of come across the northern hemisphere, dropped into, North America. And then, it just seems like they just didn't quite there's corvids in South America. There's jays.
Right.
But the corvus just didn't quite make that geographical leap. And probably it was, something about the competition that was present. Maybe there's some like geographic barriers, although we know these animals live in basically every ecosystem. Ravens can do just as well in the desert as they can in the high mountains in the wintertime.
Right.
But there was some barrier, and there's probably folks that have a better understanding of this than I do. Because I've mostly been focused on kind of like the behavioral part of these animals as opposed to like the evolutionary taxonomy part. But that's my sort of general understanding.
I mean, I understand when they're not in a country like hummingbirds aren't in, I don't think they're in England, right? But that makes sense more to me. When South America, they could eventually migrate down. But again, I'm off track. Let's talk crows some more. So Can you tell everybody? I was really surprised how big their wingspan, the small ones are, even how big they are, and that. And then I want to get into the intelligence, all the different things, how you study them versus the lab rat studying people do, and all that, which I love, by the way. So can we just kind of just bounce around and you go your direction, and I'll just kind of keep my mouth shut for once in a while.
Sure. So one thing that might surprise folks is that, again, apparently we're spending a lot of time on the taxonomic tree, but so crows and ravens are songbirds. And ravens are actually, common ravens are the biggest songbird in the world. And like you mentioned, they are really big birds. And so often when people ask me, how do I tell the difference between a crow or a raven? If you are an urban residing person, probably the corvus bird that you're interacting with most is a crow. Depending on your city, it might not be. It could be a raven, but probably it's a crow.
It's a crow.
And so I often tell people, when you do see your first raven, you are going to know.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's going to be so much bigger
A lot bigger.
than you are used to. And crows are already like big birds.
Yeah.
They're very robust birds. But ravens are like red-tailed hawk-sized bird. It's going to feel like a raptor in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so they're big animals. I mean, you strip them down and you realize there's actually not as much there as one might think, but when they've got their full feathered costume on, they are big and pretty powerful birds.
Yeah, because I think, the crows their small wings are like 2.5 feet or something, and I didn't realize they could be that big. But I've seen ravens, so I've seen up in Canada in particular. There's a lot of ravens up there, and I've seen some really big ones.
Mm-hmm.
But let's just bypass that and get on to the intelligence and how you studied them and what you've learned. And it's fascinating. They're so smart and just their traits and whatever you want to do for people to really understand and demystify them. Let's just do that.
Yeah. So we already talked a little bit about kind of how we define intelligence and some of the features that we're looking for. And so a lot of people are kind of generally familiar with the fact that these birds are smart. And so I think some good background to kind of tack on to that is to understand why that is a surprise, right? Because for a lot of folks, they're either coming to that being like, oh, really? I kind of thought that birds like weren't very smart, or feeling a little indignant that like you could possibly question that. But both of those come from the same place, which is that for a very, very long time, Western science didn't sort of give birds enough credit. And there was a couple of reasons for that. One was that a lot of the early behavioral work that was done on birds was done on species that don't tap into that cognitive toolbox that we talked about very much, right? These are birds that are acting a little bit more on instinct, and that is evident in their behavior. And we kind of took that and overgeneralized it to be representative of all birds. Another reason for that is that their brains are really different than ours. And for a long time, Western scientists had this, vision of this kind of linear progression of the brain that starts with the very rudimentary, small, smooth brains of things like amphibians, and then kind of had this linear progression to the really big, wrinkly brains of ourselves and the other mammals. And birds have small, smooth brains like a reptile. And so we kind of misunderstand that they're organized in a little different way. And so we kind of took that to mean that their brains just must not have the same kind of mental processing ability that ours do. And now we understand it to be more analogous to when we're comparing like corvids and parrots to primates,
right?
Not all birds necessarily, but at least with those kind of two big groups. Now we understand it to be more analogous to like a PC and a Mac, right? they're both computers. They do pretty much the same stuff, but the operating systems, the way that they're like put together, are definitely different. They are patently different.
Well, I was thinking of a gas car versus an electric car. Same idea. They're both cars, but they're run differently.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's another really great analogy. And so, and it just took us a while to catch up and catch on to that idea. But we have now, and there's been a lot of, over the past, many decades kind of at this point, there's been a lot of focused attention to trying to understand cognition in these animals because it does present a really interesting question of like, why? Why are people smart? Why are chimpanzees smart? Why are dolphins smart? Why are crows smart? What sort of leads to that? And often it gets, again, oversimplified, and we tend to sort of fall back on our sort of linear hierarchical thinking, ways of thinking, which we shouldn't be doing. But there is this kind of interesting question of like, what is it that those groups all have in common with each other that is the recipe for this kind of more advanced cognitive ability? And that was kind of the big picture thing that I came into being really interested in when I started looking at these birds. And we're still kind of exploring, we still haven't gotten just a nice clean answer to that question, but it has definitely prompted us to understand the cognitive abilities of these birds in ways that we scarcely kind of imagined before. And so that leads to a lot of studies and headlines and articles that I think that increasingly the average person, even people who don't care about birds or crows specifically, end up kind of seeing because they, just get passed around on Facebook, or they kind of, get, you see the headlines in the news or the newspaper or whatever. And so I think most, and this might be a little naive, but in my experience, I think most people are familiar with this idea that they are very smart, particularly when it's framed as like crows being as smart as, kids, 5-year-old, 8-year-old kids. That's a common headline I see in like National Geographic and some of these science like outlets. And the thing that I want listeners to take away from that is, and that I think that we have been kind of touching on throughout our talk so far, is this idea that I want to affirm that yes, these birds are unique and impressive relative to most other birds and relative to most other animals.
Right.
But the caveat I want to add to that is that though those headlines are not generated off of the shared ubiquitous behaviors of all of the corvids collectively, they're often generated from something that one single species does. So for example, a really common question that I get asked is it true that crows make tools? And the answer is yes, that is true. But the caveat is there's only one species that does that in the wild.
One crow species or one species?
One crow species. One crow species.
Oh, really? Which one is that?
So it's called the New Caledonian crow.
Okay.
Now there's evidence that rooks will make tools in captivity. There's also evidence that the Hawaiian crow, the alala, will make tools. Unfortunately, their only option is to make them in captivity because they're extinct in the wild. They probably did it in the wild, but we didn't have a chance to observe that before we caused their extinction. But so New Caledonian crows are the only species that actually produce hook or tools. One of the types of tools that they produce is a hook.
Right.
And they're the only ones that do that in the wild. And so while I want people to be very excited about these birds and in general sort of, thinking about them as these like really cool, really smart animals, I also want to caution people against assuming that the sort of amazing feats of intelligence that they read about or see are something that their backyard corvids are also doing, because that may or may not be the case, depending on the types of corvids that live in your backyard.
Well, one of the things I read too when I was doing my homework was that there brain to body ratio is as much larger than other birds. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, yeah. So that was one of the kind of classic mistakes that I didn't touch on earlier, which is this idea we were a little too obsessed with absolute size, right?
Mm-hmm.
A crow brain is about the size of a walnut. That's not very big. But like you're saying, what actually counts is not its total size, but its size relative to the rest of its body,
Right.
which is why a blue whale, which has a humongous brain and is, can do some impressive things, its brain to body ratio, though, despite how big its brain is smaller than our brain to body ratio or a crow's.
And so, I here's a theory I have. So and usually I'm wrong in my theories. So this is the thing. So when I was doing the homework, the way I understood it, the way I read it, again, maybe I have got a much very smaller crow brain than most, is that the way you approach it, the traditional way, I'm sure other people were too, but probably the traditional way was like study the crows like in a lab setting or whatever. But you go out in the environment and you really observe and you watch how they interact and do all the different things. Am I correct on that part? Is that how your main study is?
Yeah, so you're right, but I think it offers an opportunity to talk about the differences there.
Okay.
Because a lot of the cognitive work is done in a more lab controlled setting.
Controlled environment. Okay.
Yeah, and so the reason that we might have those different approaches is so we could just dive into the work that I did, so people kind of know what we're referencing. But so I spent my PhD studying crow funerals. And what I mean by that is when a crow dies and that dead body is observed by another crow, most often what happens is that crow will produce an alarm call and that results in the attraction of other crows to the area. They'll form this big group. They'll be flying around, making a lot of noise, sitting in the treetops, clearly, observing this body. And then after about 20 minutes or so, they'll kind of slowly start to disperse. So that's the most basic blueprint of what a crow funeral looks like.
Right.
So to understand certain components of that behavior, it's really essential that we are monitoring it in the wild.
Right.
So that I can see really genuine responses. I'm still manipulating it. And so, for example, one of the studies I did is, okay, well, if they're having this reaction, in some ways it looks like the same reaction they have towards a predator, where they are alarm calling, they are gathering together, right? So if I want to know, like, what are the differences, I need to produce this reaction towards a dead crow, towards a predator, and then towards a dead non-crow, so that I can compare all of these different responses and see, like, is it the same thing across all of these things, or is it more intense here, or are the vocalizations different, whatever it is. But for other things, it would be a little too hard to produce the thing that you want to test. So for example, like a really classic cognitive test is the string pull test, where you tie a string to a branch, and at the end of that string, hanging down from the branch, is like a piece of food that the bird wants. Crows and ravens are not good at they're not hovering birds, and so they have a really hard time just kind of like on the fly, like grabbing it. So the better strategy is to perch on top of the branch and pull the string up, where you pull, tuck the slack under your foot, pull, tuck the new slack under your foot, right? We can sort of imagine that. That is a really great sort of causal reasoning test.
Sure.
But that's a hard thing to ask a wild bird to do. You could spend many, many hours sort of hoping that one would come by,
that makes sense.
But it's hard. So whether we're in a lab setting or a wild setting really depends on the type of question that we're asking.
Right.
And for me, as a field biologist, I sort of have tailored my career towards making sure that the questions I was asking are ones that let me be outside in the
Yeah,
environment.
that makes sense.
But other people, that's not how they like to do their science. They like to do the lab-based science, and we need both groups.
Sure.
But that's kind of what drives those different methods of study.
So where I, again with my crow brain, anyway, so what I really envisioned when I was kind of digging into this thing, I was thinking about you, and I was thinking about you being outside, and also the comparison of the crows or the corvids to the primates, right? Where we
Mm-hmm.
just assumed that the primates were so much smarter when maybe they're not as smart. They're just as smart, but maybe there are other things that are just as smart as well. So I really was kind of liking you to the Jane Goodalls and the Diane Fossey people. They're out in the field and really paying attention, and that's kind of where I really came to. I said, well, she's kind of like that, really, is what she really is. Which is kind of true.
That is kind of true. That's an incredibly nice thing to say.
Well, see, I'm your best friend now.
I would say that one big difference between the work that I was doing and the work that they were doing is for my PhD. They were doing much more observational studies where they weren't really manipulated. There were cases where they did, but they kind of got their names were made on this kind of immersive documentarian style of scientific observation where they were just watching these animals in their completely native environment, writing down everything that they were doing, and then looking for patterns and extracting the sort of rhyme and reason to that from those many hours of completely sort of unadulterated observation. And that we have to sort of take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, because obviously we've all seen the pictures. Like their presence was very known to the animals that they were watching, and eventually there were interactions that do kind of change things a little bit, but in general, that was like an observational study versus what I do. So we can kind of put that on one end of the spectrum. And then what I do is I'm in the wild watching wild animals, but I am manipulating them, where I am creating particular scenarios that I'm trying to get them to respond to.
Sure.
And I'm changing
Right.
those scenarios. And then on the far end is like when we have captive groups of animals
Hmm.
where we then are controlling kind of everything, or maybe we're having them interact in really unnatural ways. Like, for example, there's some really cool studies that have looked at the birds, crows, particularly carrion crows, abilities to understand quantities, counting. That's just not something that you can do in the wild. But if you can train a crow to interact with a computer, suddenly you can ask a lot of really interesting and a lot more sophisticated questions. All of those things help us understand these animals, but they are kind of different ways to approach the
Well, I'm going to
process.
give you more credit because I'm sure you weren't actually manipulating, but I'm sure you were observing at different times too. So I'm going to give you more credit than you're giving yourself because I'm sure you were out there paying attention to that. Let's talk about their facial recognition thing too. And I read about the study, and I'll get into it after that because they'll remember people years later. Can you talk a little, address that too? I found that fascinating as well. It's really I'm a big crow guy now. I'm going to call myself Crow.
Yeah, that's how it happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for a long time, humans have understood that crows and ravens could remember our faces. And we see evidence of this in, the field notes of various scientists and the sort of word to mouth storytelling of people who made the mistake of having bad interactions with crows and getting harassed. And so kind of like the work that I did with the funerals, it wasn't my research that put it into the world that these birds have funerals. Lots of people understood that. There's references to it in the Quran, for example. So that wasn't new. What was new is basically putting guardrails on asking questions about it so that we could tease out really discrete pieces of information. And so the facial recognition study, the key thing there was, yes, it did sort of demonstrate and cement this long held understanding that many many types of people around the world had already come to know, which is that crows recognize your faces, but it did this in this really systematic way so that we can really confidently say, if you have a single bad interaction with a crow, they remember you. And really specifically, the thing that they're remembering is your face.
Right.
Now, a lot of people who identify themselves as crow feeders, who have crows they interact with every day, might say, no, it's not just your face. I know, because if I have my mask on and my hood up, they still see me, and you're not wrong. But the first thing that they learn is your face. Over time, they add in those other details.
Right.
So we were able to sort of, and I'm saying I actually didn't participate in that study. I'm sort of using the royal capital W, we.
Right.
But that was before my time at UW.
Was this the caveman thing?
This is the caveman thing. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think that's so cool.
Yeah. So what they did is they would wear these really distinctive masks.
Right.
The caveman mask, and then they had a Dick Cheney mask, and they would capture the crows.
Yeah.
Which was it's not a deadly experience for a crow, but they don't like it. They certainly don't like it.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, they capture them, they put leg bands on them so that we can individually identify the crows and let them go. And then the question was, if they saw that person that had, taken them out of the net and put these, leg bands, which again, benign, but they don't love them.
They don't like it. You're fucking with them. Excuse my
Yeah,
friend.
they're like, you put something on me and that wasn't there before. And I have a certain amount of feelings about that.
Right.
If they see that person again, are they just like, oh,
yeah,
I don't know him. Are they going to pull a Mariah Carey and just, I don't know them?
Right.
Or are they going to pay attention, or are they going to treat them like a threat? And so what they found was that they definitely recognized them, and they were very upset when they saw them in the future. And that had a really interesting side effect, which is that it wasn't just the banded crows that were upset. Non-banded crows, meaning birds that had never had a direct interaction with this person, were also learning this information. So it was not only that the original sort of targeted individuals or pairs were learning these faces, but that information was getting passed through the broader kind of crow community. Yeah.
Well, and by the way, for you guys listening, the way they did that too, because we didn't really say it. So they wore a mask to do this thing, and the way they tested, they put the mask back on. When they were wearing the mask, that's when they recognized them, right?
Exactly. And and eventually they sort of increased because, and I think it's a fair criticism. Some people said, well, a caveman mask and one of those goofy Halloween Dick Cheneys, those don't really look like human faces. Like, those are pretty weird things.
Right.
And so ultimately they expanded the study out to use these really much more sinister, in a lot of ways, much more sinister looking masks, because they were just molds of real people's faces that they turned into latex masks. So they had kind of a horrible, like, Freddy Krueger, I don't know, it looked like you just cut somebody's face off wearing it.
The Wicked Witch of the West.
Yeah, but they were much less sort of
comical
caricatures. Yeah, they looked like, maybe a little bit off, but they looked like people's faces.
Yeah.
And they found the same. They found the same thing.
I have one or two questions. So, getting to the funerals and getting to this, one of the things that, because the misconception of funerals, people thought there was like a human funeral, which is really what they were doing, was they were going there to learn, maybe to protect himself down the road. But one of the questions I had, because I know they react to kindness. If you feed them all the time, they know who you are because you're feeding them, and they kind of react to that.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have, and I don't know if it's been studied or if but do they experience grief? Like when one dies, do they have grief?
That's a great question, and not one that we know the answer to yet, which I know you're going to have some listeners that go, I know the answer to that question.
But the study hasn't been done.
The study hasn't been done, and it's a complicated question because on the one hand, right, I think one of the most devastating things that Western science has ever done has been to perpetuate this idea of human exceptionalism.
Right.
again, returning to this idea that evolution is somehow this linear process of which humans are the pinnacle of success.
I know.
That's just not true in many ways.
Yeah.
From a scientific perspective of like
Sure.
how you define success, it's just simply not true.
We defined it ourselves, so we created that definition at the end of the day.
Exactly. And kind of the same thing goes with that, where like a lot of the definitions we were putting around it were sort of designed to make it so that people were sort of at the top of that pinnacle.
Because we're the best.
And so I don't want listeners to misunderstand what I'm about to say as me sort of buying into that idea. But what I spend a lot of time thinking about is when we look at animals, right? What we can see, the whole beauty of biodiversity and evolution is that everything kind of has their special thing. They have something that's like been their niche in their world, their little place in the world that they're really good at that allows them to persist. And the way that collectively, right, the way that animals interact with their environment, we really only understand our way. And we can sort of, through technology and stuff, we can start to open the box of the other ways that are possible. But your average person, the way that they interact with the world is their only understanding of what's possible to interact with the world. But actually,
Right.
there's a huge number of possibilities of how, just the most tangible thing I can think of is like a dog, right? Your dog goes on a walk, and the way that it is interpreting and getting information through smell is something that we just can scarcely begin to understand.
Exactly.
But they are getting so much information. That's kind of their special thing. And so when I think about emotional intelligence, I do think that has been kind of the human's special thing. It's something that has been really important to our success as a species because the level of emotional intelligence that we have had, I think, has been a huge contributing factor to our ability as a species to thrive and live in community and do all of the things that, when things are working well, are the things that create that ability.
Right.
But just like the dog, that doesn't mean that other animals completely lack any emotional intelligence. We can still smell. We can't smell cancer, but we can still smell. And it's really important for us to be able to smell. And when we look at these animals that have these really deep, rich social connections, it makes evolutionary sense that there would be levels of emotional intelligence that would be part of that package, because in social animals, strong bonds are a strength. They're an evolutionary strength. To a limit, though, because if you're an animal that is like a crow, that plays the role of both predator and prey, where more than, there's a good chance that when you mate, and crows and ravens mate for life, generally, divorce does happen, but generally they mate for life, right? There's a chance that you are going to be with that partner for 10 or more years. And so having a really strong, emotionally bonded connection could be a really important component of what makes that possible and what makes that successful. But at the same time, crows die. Their life expectancy, their risk of dying, of losing your mate, is not zero. And to be able to move on from that relatively quickly and find a new mate is also valuable. Because if you are sort of stunted from being able to go through that process, then you're not producing as many offspring, which, when we're thinking in a strictly natural selective context, is kind of the name of the game. And I've seen that, right? There was I think probably the best example is there was a really famous crow in Canada called Canuck, who was kind of a local celebrity. He had been, are you familiar with Canuck, Mark?
Well, I'm familiar with the term. The Canadians are called Canucks, yeah.
Yeah, Canadians are called Canucks. So this was, some of your listeners may know who Canuck was. But if you don't, look him up. But very, very famous local crow in the Vancouver area. Had been rescued by a person and just was kind of a local celebrity because he wild, he lived in the wild, but he would come and kind of perch on your shoulder and hand feed, and was very friendly, and as generally is kind of the long-term prognosis for a bird like that, eventually kind of prematurely disappeared, unknown reasons. And he was partnered at the time that happened. And his partner, by the next breeding season, had found a new mate and moved on, right? And it is to her advantage to be able to do that. Same when their kids die. And their kids do, about 50% of crow offspring die within their first year. So if they have to expend a great deal of emotional output and energy, in this kind of deep grieving state, that's not as evolutionarily useful to them, right? So, but it's a hard, it's a hard question to put all of those together. And so that's why I say, despite my, the amount of time that I've spent with crows, and when you spend a lot of time with crows, it's really hard not to just be like, of course they grieve, you idiot. Of course, have you ever watched them? Look how cute they are with each other.
Yeah.
But when I sort of put all of the pieces in place, it just reins me in a little bit and expands my thinking to, well, maybe the way that they're interacting with each other in the world is just different than what I'm thinking of as a possibility through the lens of my own human experience.
Perception is reality.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the best gifts that we can give animals, is to appreciate that there's a possibility of behavior and ways of interacting with their environment and just ways of existing that are beyond our ability to conceptualize, but that shouldn't degrade the value and respect that we give those creatures and their place in the world.
100% agree. One of the things I like too is because they're real big family units, and they're similar. This comes back to you being the Jane Goodall, but the juveniles stay with the family a lot longer because they're learning and observing in the world, which is pretty wild. And even the teenagers take care of the baby, and they're learning from that, similar to primates and dolphins and some of the other intelligent species that are out there, which I think at some level, again, not to go along where you're saying, you have to kind of take a step back, and at some level it correlates. They're actually learning all the time and paying attention to things, which I think it's just fascinating.
Yeah, there's definitely a correlation between cognition and sort of extended parental care, which is the term that we would just use to describe what you're doing, where instead of
parental care, that's way better than the way I say it. I like that word.
Where you think about a duckling, right?
Yeah.
Or you have this kind of short window, and then you rub, and it's like, get out of here, kid.
Yeah.
Versus some bird and ravens, they don't do the extended parental care. They have that short window. Yeah, they have they take care of their kids up until kind of the end of the breeding season. But once they hit a certain age, it's like, get off the territory. I don't want to see you again. So they do not do the cooperative breeding, which is the term for what you were describing earlier, where you have these kind of multi-generational family units.
Yeah, that's cool.
Though I do want to include that not all cooperative, not all helpers. So that's the term for the subadults that are not the primary pair.
Babysitters.
They're not always related.
Oh, really?
Sometimes they're unrelated birds. Yeah. So sometimes those units are not comprised just of people within the family, multi-generations within the family unit.
Well, that happens with baboons as well. They do the same thing. They have other mothers, basically. They're all the women all hang out together and take care of all the babies together. But there's other, you could have multiple mothers.
Yeah, and that's I'm sure you probably know more about that than me. But what I know is that in that example, you have this kind of troop,
right?
This matriarchal. Well, it's not a matriarchy, but you have this troop system of except for the the males that come in and sort of, but they are in some way, they're like, in some ways peripheral to the daily goings on of the social units, which is mostly driven by the females like you're getting at. But anyway, I'm not a baboon expert, but it's a different, just to say that that's a different framework than what the crows do.
It goes right back to what you're saying. We just have to understand and accept the fact that we don't fully understand it, right? At some level.
Yeah. There's lots of different ways to be social.
And we'll be right back.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? PrEP Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover PrEP Therapy today at PrepVet.com. Save 10% with promo code FurRealPodcast, covered by most pet insurance.
So I read about the crows in Japan that throw the nuts on the ground so cars drive over so they'll crack the nuts for them, which is really cool.
Yeah.
And now tell me about the other one I want to know about is the crows that take bread and they throw it in the water to bait fish so they can get a fish. Is that real?
So that's another good example of something it's real in the sense that I have seen videos of it.
Yeah.
That don't appear to be doctored. It is not a behavior that I think that we have studied, kind of like the gift giving. It's not a behavior that we've studied systematically enough to kind of say, like, here's what they're doing. They understand that's a great example of, like, do they understand what they're doing? Do they know that fish eat bread? And if they put bread in the water, the fish come? Or are they just kind of like, I don't know. I tossed bread and the fish came, and I don't really care about the steps in between.
Instinctual, maybe too.
Yeah,
we've done this all forever, and the fish comes, so we eat it. We don't know why, but they're doing it.
Exactly. So that's a good example of one of those really interesting behaviors that I don't know that we have scientifically sort of sussed out yet. But that doesn't mean it's not real. Because you saw the videos. I've seen the videos.
Yeah,
seems real. The nuts we have studied.
Yeah.
So the nut cracking in Japan by the carrion crows, that was something that there was a study on where they looked at what the term we use is the cultural transmission of that behavior, because it started in a very particular place near this driving school. And they were able to track the way that behavior over time had radiated out, where clearly crows were learning from each other about this new
hey, this works. Look at us. Look at me.
Strategy.
Yeah.
As far as I know, that paper came out in the 90s. There hasn't been any work on that since. I don't know if that behavior has maybe was culturally lost, or maybe it's even more prolific than it used to be. I'm not sure, but I haven't really heard. Even though that's something that often gets featured in a lot of like nature documentaries, from a researching perspective, I don't know that there's been any new work on that since the 90s.
See, I picture the crows sitting next to me and say, watch this. Have you noticed how shiny my feathers are? I've got all this protein in my body. Watch me throw this nut down. See that? See how shiny I'm looking? You should try this. This is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
So tell me what your thoughts are on this. I didn't even look at it on this thing. I read about it a long time ago. I think it's in Sweden where they had the crows that were being rewarded for picking the cigarette butts up off the ground. And there was some company because 40% of the dirty roads or whatever were all cigarette butts, and they were bringing in and they were getting food by doing that. What do you know about it, and what do you think about it?
So I call it butts for nuts. And every 3 to 5 years, there's a new startup that promises to do this.
Right.
There was one in France. There's the Swedish one. There was one. There was the classic kind of crow vending machine TED Talk that some people know about by what's his name? Joshua Klein. Kind of was on the same premise of that idea. And the problem with the butts for nuts, short version of the story is none of these startups have ever worked. And the most recent one, which is the Swedish one, went bankrupt a few years ago. It doesn't exist anymore.
It's worked really well.
Yeah. There's a couple of problems with this idea. And none of them are that you can't train crows to do that. That is not the problem. The problem is that you can't scale it. So you can train captive crows to do this, right? Just like you can train a polar bear at the zoo to, roll over for a raisin.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to convince, because the whole premise of these butts for nuts are you train a crow, if you collect a cigarette butt and you put it in this machine, we'll give you food.
Right.
The problem is for a wild crow, after a while, or for just some individuals, the question becomes, why would I go searching for cigarettes if I could just search for food? You're sort of creating this middle step,
right,
that is unnecessary. And so, but they can do it. They have the cognition for it, the intelligence for it, and not that is a especially smart thing to do. You can train a lot of animals to do an exchange task, but once you try and be like, we're going to get an entire city's worth of crows doing this, it just never works. And the machines that you have to install to do it are expensive to maintain.
Yeah.
So it just ends up being like, why aren't we just paying human beings to keep litter off the streets, or paying for educational PSAs that try and teach people not to litter?
Right.
Why are we paying to train crows? So there's kind of that. But then there's this whole other premise of like, do we want to be exploiting wildlife in this way? Cigarette butts we know that they're toxic. Is it harmful for crows? That is kind of a complicated thing where like they are harmful, but is it harmful enough within the lifespan of a crow to matter? We also know that birds successfully put cigarette butts in nest material to keep parasites down, things like nest mites. So not to encourage people to just litter, but like there's like a whole complicated thing there. So my general sort of how do I feel about it is that it is the premise of it would work because these animals are smart, but it's not worth doing.
So, because a group of crows is called a murder. Mm-hmm. What is that named some like, the whole mythical that they're purveyors of death and things like that, or where did that come from? Do you have any idea?
I don't have a specific answer, but in general, so the word we use for that is a colloquialism. So most groups of animals have like a colloquial name. Crows, it's murder. Ravens, it's unkindness. Flamingos, flamboyance, right? These are not, I think it's really important to stress, these are not scientific terms. You'll never see these terms in a paper. I call them flocks of crows. I don't call them murders of crows.
Here's something for you. Do you know what a group of snow leopards are called?
I don't.
Guess what? There isn't one because they never hang out with each other, truthfully.
I should have seen that coming. Yeah.
They don't have a name. They didn't give them a name.
They don't have a name. Of course.
Okay, yeah.
Good.
It's true.
Yeah. No, I mean, lions are kind of the one exception. Cats are generally very solitary creatures. But yeah, so those words, people will be like, this is the official name for a group of crows. No, it's not.
Oh, okay.
It's maybe in the dictionary, but official.
Because it sounds cool now.
Yeah, official, we mean like, it's not a scientific term. And its origins likely do sort of harken back to, crows in the Western world, crows and ravens in the Western world have had kind of an up and down sort of reputation throughout time. But particularly during, periods of mass human mortality, whether that was from violence or from disease, those have become sort of sensitive sticking points for the Europeans because we don't like seeing our dead consumed by animals. That's not something that's part of our sort of afterlife process. And so we tend to think poorly of animals that come to feast on our bodies. And that is where a lot of those negative associations have their roots in. Now, if you go to other parts of the world where that's either not a problem or is actually the point, you don't see that same kind of negativity towards the carrion eaters of the world.
Yeah. Okay. So what what have we not talked about? I mean, you know, with me, I could talk for days. What is there anything that specifically we haven't covered that we should bring up that you think that people would be interested?
Yeah, I think probably the last thing I'd want to cover is a lot of people have this conception that because the crows that live in their neighborhoods are common, maybe even increasing in number, that is true of the global of crows and ravens globally around the world. And that's not true. And in fact, some of the species of crows and ravens in the world represent some of the most endangered animals on the planet. So I talked before about the Hawaiian crow,
Right.
the alala, which is extinct in the wild. They're doing some captive rearing and have a new release program on Maui. But those crows have been functionally extinct, meaning they are no longer serving their ecosystem role because they're not in the wild for decades. The aga, which is the Mariana crow, only lives on one island in the world, Rota, which is in the Northern Mariana Islands. It used to also live on Guam, but it was extirpated by the introduction of the brown tree snake. Extirpated means that an organism has left an area. It's not completely extinct, but it no longer lives in a big area that it used to.
Well, the brown snake was brought onto the island. It wasn't even there originally. And then they've taken over the entire island.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and I think that's important both because it's reflective of this idea of biodiversity that we talked about earlier. And I think that's important for people to remember that just because some species of crows and ravens are urban adapters, are animals that can exploit and do really well in the environments that we create, not all of them are. Some of them are forest specialists that do really poorly when we cut down forests for human development. And a lot of island species especially fall into that category. And so sometimes folks think like, well, if I like crows, then I don't really have to worry about conservation. But that's actually not true. There are a number of species around the world that are, in desperate need of conservation intervention because they are declining dramatically or have already essentially been eliminated.
You know what's crazy about that? Because in one of my notes when I was doing the homework, it's one of the things I read. I was going to actually ask about it, but we didn't get to. Was it said that the crows have grown 20% per decade for 40 years, which must be a specific, maybe it's American crow or something like that. But that's some statistic I read, and I said, "Wow, that's one of the rare things you hear." But without knowing everything else, again, perception is reality, right?
Yeah, and the other thing I'll add to that is that particularly on the East Coast in the 90s, crows were hit really hard by West Nile virus. There was a massive die-off. In the aftermath of that die-off, there was then a pretty rapid expansion once the disease had kind of settled down. It's still a major threat to crows and ravens. But sometimes what people, especially people who don't like crows, will share are snapshots of population growth from that time period as kind of a tool to talk about how these birds are really out of control.
Look at, they're taking over the world.
Exactly. But what they're sampling is this period of time after a really intense die-off where the population was rebounding. So that's something to just kind of be mindful of. Dates are very important when we talk about growth patterns.
So I want to do the joke at the end, but I wanted for people to find out more about you, your books, whatever, how they find you. If they want to learn more, where do they go? Point everybody in a cool places, and let's get them to get to know the Kaeli Swift girl that I know now.
Okay, so the first place you can go is my blog, corvidresearch.blog. I will admit that I've been incredibly delinquent the past couple of years contributing new articles, but as a starting point, I have hundreds of articles really meant to introduce you to these birds and answer a lot of the most essential questions that people often have about them. From there, if you want a little bit flashier media, you can check out my TikTok and Instagram pages, also at the Corvid Research handle. I used to be on Twitter, not really anymore.
Me either.
But you can still find me Instagram, TikTok. Again, that's become a little bit more of a repository, although I made a New Year's resolution that I would make more videos soon. But It's tough, but those are great places to look for videos. Again, if you just want to like really dive in and learn about a lot about these birds, there's enough content there that I promise you'll be busy for a while.
And for everybody that's listening, if you go to the description of the episode, we're recording now, but I'll have all that information in there too.
Mark, I actually, if you want to switch, I do actually have a joke.
Oh, awesome. Great.
Yeah.
So as everybody knows, let me just set it up real quick. For everybody, as I'm always saying, when I tell this joke, I know you're cringing when you hear mine. I'm always happy to have the guest do one. But for you guys, if you ever want to be on the show and you want your grandkids, nieces, nephews, whatever, or if you want to be on the show, if you send me an email at mcowforrealpodcast.com, I promise you the guest and me would welcome you telling the joke versus us. And I'm so glad you're telling the joke, so let's hear it.
So a few years ago, as a crow scientist, I got this call from a couple different fish and wildlife agencies in the Midwest were really concerned because they kept finding these dead crows in the road, and they didn't know what was going on, and so I went down there, and as you know, I love to observe the crows, and so I would wait by the road and watch kind of how they were interacting with the street and the vehicles and stuff, and eventually I figured out I could go back to the Fish and Wildlife agencies. And I said, well, the answer actually was very simple, which is that crows, when they're when they have birds down on the ground getting food and a vehicle's approaching, they know how to say "ka," but they don't know how to say "truck."
Pretty good.
There you go. That's the best one I have.
Yours is way better than mine, and I'm going to tell you offline so nobody has to hear it here. Trust me. So first off, Kaylee, thanks so much for being on the show. I'm fascinated. I love what you're doing. I'm going to say go Seahawks since you're up there, but really, thanks so much for being on the show. I really, really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, Mark.
More mine for sure. And then for everybody else that's listening, as I always say, keep following, like, do all those things, subscribe, pass the word on. The more we grow, the more opportunities I have to have guests like Kaylee on. It's you guys that make the show. The guests are obviously the meal for the show, but really, it's really, really important. But really, seriously, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for listening. For real.
That concludes this episode of For Real with your host, Mark Kyle. For previous and future episodes of For Real, listen via all major podcast streaming sites.